I'm Julia Hurst. I'm from Sheffield Hallam, and I'm introducing Nic tonight in my role as I'm the lead for public health in the Faculty of Development and Society. And the Public Health Hub in Sheffield Hallam is a cross-faculty hub for teaching, learning, consultancy, research, knowledge transfer, whatever it is. We serve as almost like a conduit for people from the outside world to get in touch with us and facilitate whatever it is they'd like us to facilitate in relation to public health. We're co-hosting this tonight, and it's with great pleasure that I'm welcoming Nic Marks, who's the founder of the Centre for Wellbeing. He spent the day at a workshop today, so he's already had plenty to do. So thank you, Nic, and I apologise for the audience, but I gather a lot of people are stuck on the motorway.
That's okay.
I think Nic's just going to suck it and see, aren't you?
Yeah. But you can interrupt me, I think, would be the best thing, and ask me questions and make it more lively.
Okay. Thanks, Nic.
Okay. So I was going to talk today about our work at the Centre for Wellbeing and what a sort of way we're thinking about things, which is about what I call a happier way of life, is actually using the idea of wellbeing and happiness to try and open up areas for thinking differently. I use the words wellbeing and happiness almost interchangeably. Wellbeing is the more policy-focused one. Happiness is the more public-focused one. And I am tending to use the word happiness more than I used to at the moment. And I think that's really because connecting with the public, I think happiness works better than well-being. And well-being has worked better in policy. So we do some work which is sort of called well-being and national accounts of well-being and things like that. And some we do happiness, Happy Planet Index, things like that, which we do more public-faced. But I think there's a possibility that we could start to talk about happiness more in policy because it's got a more emotional tone to it as a word. And it's actually interesting, when people reject it as a word, it's interesting to actually examine their reasons for why they're rejecting it as a word, why they think government should not be about happiness in any way. And sometimes I think you can actually help unpick the story a bit more about what the resistance to it is by using the slightly more controversial word, if you like, happiness. I think that most of you know New Economics Foundation and where we came from and things. But anyway, we were founded in somewhere between 84 and 86. It's a little bit difficult to know exactly when the organisation started and when it didn't. But what certainly happened was that the G7 summit came to London in 1984. There was a whole alternative conference that went on that time that was called TOES, the Other Economic Summit. And somewhere out of that, the legacy organisation was New Economics Foundation. We're quite Schumacherian. Schumacher talked about, Fritz Schumacher talked about economics as if people mattered, and our strapline is economics as if people and the planet mattered. And it really came out of that debate. The work on wellbeing, I started there in 2001. It literally was me doing 1 day a week volunteering, trying to think about this idea. But by 2005, we'd done enough work that we could actually start to employ people. And we founded the Centre for Wellbeing. There are now 7 staff working, 6.5 at one's half time, working full time on the issue of wellbeing, how we measure it, how policy should be about it. I think we're the largest policy-focused wellbeing research team in the world. So I certainly haven't heard of any larger. The Young Foundation do some work on wellbeing, but they're slightly smaller and slightly different. But really, there's nowhere else that I know of that does much. Some people do bits of work, but not does such a sort of program of work. So, roughly speaking, this is what I was going to be talking about today, but maybe we might want to lighten it a bit. I don't know. I was going to firstly talk about happiness, why it's a common human aspiration, thinking about it in a dynamic way, that it's not just a place you get to and it's like not just a beach you get to and you lie there. I'll work on how you can, the sort of positive actions you can take in your life to be happier. And then I was going to pull it out into what a happier society might look like, starting with organisations, why happiness is a serious business, and then a little bit out into sort of, haven't really got many slides on this, but the idea that a big society isn't enough. Actually, we need a happier, more caring, altruistic society. and how it's very empty as an expression, big society. And I think that's one of the reasons people don't get it, is that, and for some extent we already have a big society. So whilst it works, small state, big society, which I suppose is what the play on the word is, I don't think it's a very useful word at all. And then into the idea about, does happiness make any sense when we live in an unjust, unsustainable world, and where we do think it adds to the narrative with the Happy Planet Index. So, we can see. If you get bored, you can put your hand up.
Make us happy.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. I find most people do enjoy it. And actually, this summer I gave a TED lecture. If any of you know the TED lectures, so I don't really feel in need of great big audiences because I've just had one great big audience. So that's fine. So this is about happiness as a dynamic system, which is that often we can think of happiness as I said, it's like a beach we get to, it's a state. And I think this is really misleading. It's actually very, very dynamic, interconnected, and we need to think about it in those terms. So this is a model we did for the Government Office of Science, the Foresight Project, on how we could understand well-being and happiness in a policy-focused world. And what we start off with is at the foundation at the bottom, as we say, there's two things going on. One is that we have the people, psychological resources, we call it, but basically those more trait-like qualities of people that are more stable through time. And then we have the enabling conditions. And really these are, where I am and who I am, or where am I from sometimes. But basically there's a dynamic interplay between these, and it's important to realize that because sometimes we get people thrive in very difficult circumstances and other people sink in quite benign circumstances. And that's because these two things are going on, that we bring ourselves to the circumstances. And so it's important for policy to think about the fact that there are at least two sort of foundations to what's going on. And they come together and mix together really in what we call functioning well, but really is what we're doing is, we interplay. Everything we do is partly who I am, partly where I am. I am myself and my circumstances. One Spanish philosopher whose name I can't remember, but we are both of those things. We can't take ourselves out of our context, and it's naive to think that we're individuals just playing out some individual story. We're very culturally and socially embedded, but it affects what we do and how we do that. And then out of what we do and this sort of whole system really emerges our experience of life. I mean, I would say our sort of shortest definition of what well-being is the quality of people's experience of life. And our experience, is sort of, it's played out moment to moment, our experience, but it sort of emerges out of what we do. So sometimes I call that, how are we feeling? What am I feeling? So we've got sort of information there, sort of bits of the system, which is, who we are, where we're from, what we're doing, and how we're feeling. And what makes this dynamic is that there are sort of feedback loops and energy flows around this system in lots of different ways, but two ways that it's probably worth mentioning explicitly is that what we do shapes our environment. I mean, we know that about human beings. We interplay with the environment the whole time. So if you have someone who's a pain in the arse in your team, you know about it and it affects the environment for everybody. But conversely, if your community has a really good group of altruistic people in them, they can really positively contribute to that place. So that's the feedback loop from functioning well to enabling conditions. And then the other one is feedback loop from our experience of life to our psychological resources. And this really is what a lot of psychology is about, that actually what we experience shapes who we are. And so if we have good experiences and we feel good, then they actually start to build our resources for the future. And if we have bad, frightening experiences, we tend to narrow down. So the emotions in the organism really are functional in a way. They are a feedback loop for us to sort of change what we're doing or where we're going. So, we've known that fear and anger are related with the fight and flight mechanism for absolutely ages. But what's probably only recently been better understood is what's joy about, what's contentment about, what's happiness about. And one of the interesting things is that when we're frightened or angry, we're very narrowly focused on specific threats in the environment. But when we're happy, we're actually very broad and looking out. And we're what psychologists call it open to experience. And we're able to seize opportunities. So it's in the space of opportunities and creativity that happiness is really important, whereas fear and anger are very useful for dealing with threats. So they have different functions in the organism. And the point really is that we learn from those emotional experiences if we take notice of them and we build them into. So, for example, the child that is happy and plays learns all sorts of social skills, emotional intelligence, even motor skills. They're going to get into that sort of stuff. The child that doesn't play, that isn't happy, is going to close down and not learn so much as we go along. So, as I said, this slide should have come earlier, really. But anyway, this was all for the Foresight project, which was this. I don't know if any of you heard of the Foresight project on mental capital and well-being, but the Foresight projects run their big government programs. In some ways they're big. They involve a lot of academics and experts, and it was about a 2-year project. So we did 2 projects. One was that dynamic model, and the other one was something called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing. Have any of you heard of the 5 Ways to Wellbeing? A couple of you have. So the idea of this and the absolute pitch to Foresight was that we needed the equivalent of 5 fruit and vegetables a day, but for positive mental health and well-being. And I deliberately pitched it to them that it would be 5. It is basically public mental health messaging, and people can only deal with lists of between about 3 and 6, 3 and 7 items. They don't remember. If you start creating 10 ways or 12 ways, people don't remember them. Whereas, 5 or 6 is about the right number. But because we had number 5 so imprinted on our brains, I really wanted it to try and be 5. I did actually promise Foresight between 4 and 6, but I was hoping to get 5 because I knew it would reinforce that message, and it would be reinforced by that message. So, and the brief from Foresight was that they needed to be evidence-based, that they needed to be actions that people could take whatever their circumstances. So it's an intervention in the functioning domain of that last model. It's not intervening in who people are or where they are or what their enabling or disabling conditions are. So it's not doing anything about inequalities, lots of those structural problems which really exist. It's just saying wherever we are, what can we do that we think that better experiences and well-being will flow from. These were what they were. The first one is connect. And the idea of the words is that they are, in a way, slightly prescriptive, but they're also supposed to be an invitation. That's what the ... is there for afterwards. It's like trying to soften the fact that it's a slightly prescriptive intervention into something as personal as your well-being. But all the evidence is that our relationships are the most important thing for our well-being. Both what could be called your thick and your thin relationships, your close, intimate relationships with family, with friends, very close friends, and then your thinner relationships with acquaintances, neighbours, communities, work colleagues. And they're both important to your well-being in different ways. They're nourishing to us. And the call is to, remember to spend time and energy with them. Quite a lot of us spend too much time perhaps chasing the false goal of career or more money or something like that at the expense sometimes of our relationships. And yet the evidence would say that we would be happier if we remember to attend to them. Not that we shouldn't do other things, but to invest our time. So they're sort of the cornerstones of our life, if you like. The second one is be active. And that is that physical activity is a really good way out of any bad mood. If you are feeling grumpy, the best way to deal with it is to go outside for a walk or a run or swim or bicycle ride or even turn the radio on and dance, whatever it is, that you like to do. But actually physical activity and movement actually just shifts your whole mood quite quickly. And not only that, depression, if you can get people who are suffering from depression or anxiety or common mental disorders to exercise, that's actually a really good way of shifting them. It's obviously not easy to do that, but if you can get their motivation in that way, it's thought to be better than medication in all sorts of other ways, though lots of things are better than medication probably. But being active. The third one is take notice. And this is really about increasing our awareness about the overall life and the details in life, noticing the changing seasons, stopping and seeing something beautiful and letting it move you, taking notice of other people, what they're feeling around you, but also taking notice of what's bubbling up within you, how's your energy, listening to that, what are you interested in, what do you value, what are you passionate about, and listening to those energies, sometimes quite subtle energies from us, and actually starting to think about them. And there's lots of evidence on mindfulness from cognitive behavioural therapy about how important this is. And some people talk about, we should do meditation or something like that, and that would help us improve. And that sounds quite middle class, but if you actually think about what the most popular sport is in Britain, it's fishing, which is really not at all dissimilar to meditation, in my opinion. I mean, might be a lot of escaping the wife or something as well, but basically the idea to stop, pause, reflect in life is actually really, really good for us. The fourth one is to keep learning, which is that learning, challenge, stretch is really good for us and good for our well-being. And actually, learning throughout the whole life course is good for us in that we know that older people who keep learning have much better health outcomes than those that don't. And this is really about curiosity rather than knowledge-based learning. It's about being engaged with the world, inquiring with it. It doesn't have to be formal learning in any way at all. It could be learning a language or picking up an instrument you used to play when you were a child, or something like learning to cook a favourite dish. So these things make us more confident, and when we learn something new, we tend to enjoy it. And the final one is give, which is that generosity, altruism is really good for our well-being. In fact, it's pretty much hardwired to our reward mechanism. Lots of evidence around, people that smile, that thank other people, that do these sort of random acts of kindness, volunteering in projects. All of these things are very good for our well-being, and it helps us connect back to other people, and people find it rewarding. And so those are the sort of 5 positive actions that we suggest that there's good evidence that if you did them, well-being would start to flow out of them, happiness would start to flow out of them. And in a sense, yeah.
Sorry, can I interrupt
Yeah.
and ask a couple of questions about that? One is, to what extent are there valid metrics about this?
Yeah.
You could measure how much physical activity you have to do to generate a certain level of increased well-being, and for the others as well. And the second question is, to what extent are these correlations?
Yeah.
And to what extent is there evidence that you can intervene? If you intervene and change your behaviour, you get the desired effect. So, for example, on this last one, you said there is evidence that people who give have higher levels of well-being.
Yeah.
Well, that could be because they have higher levels of well-being. They're people who
Yeah.
give. So, to what extent is there evidence that intervening with people to encourage them, or personally deciding to change your behaviour in these ways, actually leads to a change of attitude, rather than it simply being a correlation?
Yeah. So most of the wellbeing data is from cross-sectional surveys, which means it's correlational. We were very careful to find as much as possible to find longitudinal data that was tracking people through possible. And there is, realistically, there's less data that does that on wellbeing. There's some panel surveys which you can look at stuff. There's some people that have run interventions where they've done, distance travelled before and after measurement. People rarely go back a year later and see whether the effect was short-term or long-term. That's certainly an issue with the data. There's some experimental psychology data. So, a classic one with the give one is sort of lab type experiments where they give two groups of people $100 in the morning, and one group go and spend it on themselves. And here's a gift for you to go and spend yourself, so sort of retail therapy. The other gift are asked to go and give it away during the day. You measure their happiness at the end of the day. The ones that have given it away are much happier than those that have spent it on themselves. Okay. Now, the thing is, it's not their own money they're giving away, but they had the choice to spend. It became their own money in the morning, and that's what the clear data is. And certainly, people who there's longitudinal data on people volunteering in programs, where they've had their wellbeing measured before and afterwards, and it's much higher. But there's an awful lot going on there. They're being more connected as well as giving. So there's lots of stuff going on there. But we know that sort of thing does improve people's well-being. So and we have cross-sectional data on the same thing, that people who are more generous and altruistic are happier. But we don't. That, as you say, that is correlational. But the evidence is suggesting that generosity is a driver of that, and so that works a bit to an extent. The being active, again, there is data showing through it. I don't know exactly what the level is for well-being. Our belief is it's lower than for health outcomes. That it's not about sweaty 30 minutes times a week, which of course is good for you, for your heart and da-da-da. But for happiness, we think it's lower than that. But I can't give you an exact point it is. There's, so some of this is like, and particularly the take notice one, there's a lot of evidence on like loving kindness meditation and these sort of programs of actually people's well-being and happiness increasing really quite a lot by taking on those sort of programs. But what you have in those sort of things is the sort of people that join up to those programs are probably already ripe for a change. So there's a lot going on in that process. So, I think we can only consider these 5 ways as nudges in a way, as reminders. But, the 5 fruit and vegetable, the evidence for it is actually, if you really look at the evidence base, it's not really clear that it is 5 and some people would say it should be 12, and some people say 2 is enough. There's different debates on it. It also depends, obviously, on whether it's, what type of vegetables and fruits it is. There's massive stuff. So I think we sort of have to accept we're doing some public messaging. There's some simplification of that.
Yeah. Okay.
But what's also interesting about the 5 ways is how much they've been picked up by practitioners. Is that I think that because the sort of term, in the UK, well-being's been used quite a lot, people have been asked to promote well-being without really knowing what they could do. So doing these types of activities in your local level, people are finding that they're enjoying their jobs more, but they're actually finding that they can actually engage with the public more. There was another part to your question, measurement.
Measurement, yes.
I'm going to come on to some measurement, but basically we haven't developed a 5 ways measure yet. We would like to, and it's a question of getting a project to do that, really, basically. But one of the problems with some measures of well-being is that when they're quite driven by expectations, if you're asking people for their satisfaction with life and things like that. And we actually are quite keen to develop measures which are more able to show changes in people. So actually, if you're doing behaviour, you've got more of a chance to do that because you can ask more how often questions and look at how behaviour is changing. So we want to do a blend between sort of how often are you doing these sort of things and then some outcome measures with it. That's a plan for next year to do that. So that's the sort of first third of what I was going to talk about, really, which is about, if we think about the individual, they were sort of really individually based, really, about what happiness is, why it's a common human aspiration, and how we can think about having a bit more of it. The next bit is really just about the systems around us and actually how they work, and about how we could think about happiness as both being an outcome and also something which gives us things that we want. So the first bit I want to talk about is happiness and work. I tend to call this happiness as a serious business, but we know that high well-being in an organisational context leads to lots of things that businesses want, that organisations want. So it leads to higher productivity. If we're realistic with how much higher productivity it is, it does depend on the type of job that people are doing. If they're not doing very complex jobs, there's less gain in productivity than if they're doing complex jobs that require a lot of creativity. But certainly also people who are happy in their job clearly stay longer in the job. You know, if you've got an organisation that you're happy with that doesn't keep changing itself and doesn't keep making people redundant, whatever, you know, that actually people tend to stay. So some small businesses keep staff for 20, 30 years, whereas big businesses and big organisations don't tend to as much. And actually you can look at, any way you look at the wellbeing data, that people are happiest in organisations that are under 50 employees or groups of organisations. And I think a lot of the problem we have in society, in businesses, is that in organisations, is that they're fairly dehumanised by their size. Just the simple scale of it, that you don't know everybody, and so you have to create systems to try and deal with that. And that's slightly dehumanising, and we want to be recognised as human beings. So people actually thrive much better in smaller organisations. So you have lower recruitment costs because you have less staff turnover, and recruitment costs are non-trivial. For those of us, you know, who do employ people, we know it probably costs us £10,000 every time we have to employ someone. We have to advertise. We lose productivity days. Other people have to, cover for the person that's left, and there's all sorts of stuff. You also have lower absenteeism if you've got happier staff. Quite obviously, people throw sickies left, but also people get ill less. Stress at work makes them ill. If they're not happy at work, they're going to feel their pain more. They're going to feel iller more. And so we know that. And absenteeism is a complex set of problems. You know, some of them are outside of work, some of them are inside of work. We know that the public sector is much higher than the private sector. But there again, we know the public sector employ an older demographic of people. They actually employ more people with common mental health disorders than the private sector do. So they're actually taking on riskier employees, if you like. So it's inevitable they're going to have higher absenteeism. When you adjust for that, the gap is much smaller. And probably the private sector have much higher presenteeism, which is people turning up at work and being totally absent, but they're there. So, you know, the lights are on, but no one's at home. And then also, I think quite interestingly, you can sort of start thinking about well-being as about it's linked to innovation. We know from all sorts of work from psychology that people who are happier, that have higher levels of interest, enthusiasm, are much more creative, particularly if they work in spaces where people have positive engagements together. And so businesses, organisations that want to be innovative, that actually the well-being of staff is absolutely critical. There's all sorts of stuff. I mean, the service industry is very aware of this, that actually if they want to increase customer satisfaction, if they want to increase shareholder value, they want to have customers that come back, you have to increase customer satisfaction to have customers that come back. If you want to have customer satisfaction, you need the service to be delivered with positive staff. And so they understand that you have to be investing in the experience of the employees if you want to drive that whole profit chain through to shareholder value. So that's in service delivery. But in creative industries, there's this myth really that there's the depressive creative. I mean, it's very much a myth. I mean, I don't know. As far as I understand it, is that it's the difference is that we do find these creative geniuses like, you know, Spike Milligan, Stephen Fry, whatever, who suffer from depression, but they're but that tends to be, as I understand it, bipolar depressives, not unipolar depressives. And unipolar depressives is much more sensitive to the environment than bipolar. Bipolar is more genetic. I'm getting some nodding heads. I think that's the right narrative. So actually, we don't want to be thinking that we're going to somehow squeeze creativity out of making our staff unhappy. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there shouldn't be pressure, there shouldn't be incentives, that there shouldn't be challenges given to people. But it does mean that bullying, threatening probably isn't going to be the best way to get genuine creativity. You're probably going to get some closing down rather than opening up. This was the shareholder value one, which is another thing, which is that I find this quite interesting, this bit of research that someone did in the City, which was in the 1950s, that the way that businesses, that the stock market valued businesses was 80% on their tangible asset base, their machinery, their land, their stock, their mineral rights, whatever, and only 20% was around what could be considered intangibles. Whereas that's totally flipped over in the last 50 years, where 80% of value on the stock exchange is really about intangible assets. Now, some of that is brands and intellectual property, things like that, but an awful lot of that is what would be loosely called human capital. And it's the people in the system, and lots of CEOs will stand up there and say the most important thing in the system is the people, our people in our system. Now, whether they mean that or not, that's what they tend to stay up and say. But the issue really is that human capital is not like fixed capital. It's a different beast. You don't own human capital, you rent it. You're basically paying people a wage for them to come. It's a rental agreement, not an ownership agreement. You don't have their freehold. So you have to think about how you work with them with performance. And it's one of those things around performance and well-being is that, you know, I sometimes say you can deliver a pizza, you can deliver a package, but you can't deliver well-being. Well-being is between us. It actually emerges between us. And so the relationship between the employer and the employee is a complex one, out of which, if you do it right, you're going to emerge high performance and high well-being. But you can do it wrong and you can have exactly the opposite. So I put here, it's more like coaxing than coercing. And at NEF, we take that model of well-being that we did for Foresight, and we actually use this in organisations. We're just starting to use this as a tool where we create indicators in each of those 4 domains. And the fun bit is, for me, working with it, is that we can send the survey out to people 1 week. And because we've got software that creates all the indicators, you can just go in the next week and share the results with them live. So there's none of this sort of delay between doing a staff survey and it going off somewhere. And 2 or 3 months later, a huge report lands, if you're lucky 2 or 3 months later, lands on HR's desk, who then don't know what to do with it and put it on a shelf and maybe don't do much of it. Maybe there's some things, you know, some brainstorming around it, but quite often the information is not really mined very well, it's not really used, it doesn't really get to the right people. So what we do instead is do something lighter and hopefully more interactive, in that by all these icons, they create traffic lights for them, you know, red, green, yellow. We have indicators that are very simple. They run from 0 to 10. 10 is good, 0 is bad, 5 is the UK average. And what this does is that we have lots of questions, say, about what you think of senior management. It's often very difficult to interpret these surveys. If 72% of people don't think senior management's doing a good job, you know, obviously you know 68, 54 would be better, but you don't really know if that's a bad result or what. People don't tend to like senior management wherever they are. So we have national averages for them. So we basically benchmark them. So the 5 would be the national average. And so you always know if you've got a 5.5, you've done better than national average. If you've got a 4.5, you're below. So it gives people a handle on what they're doing. It also takes out all the response biases. We have all sorts of questions where people never respond. So if it's a 1 to 5 scale, they never respond 3 for average score. It always tends to be 3.5. People tend to use the upper end of the scale more than the lower end. So it takes out all those biases that you normally get with skewed distributions and starts to make them easier to understand. And the idea really is that managers don't want to be statisticians, they want to be managers. So they want information that they can understand quickly, and that's what we try and develop for them. And what we also do is we cut the data by teams, so that teams can just sit round, have a discussion around a computer, clicking on it, and talking about what's going on for them. And you find that by people having numbers to talk about something, things which have previously just been in the ether get discussed. So, you know, I went into one organisation just the other week, actually, and they had a small organisation, I think 12 or 14 people. They had 6 managers and 8 staff. And the managers all thought that the place was very safe to speak up and challenge what was going on. And the staff all thought it was a very difficult place to speak up and challenge what was going on. And because there was a 3.5 versus a 6.5, they suddenly had a debate about this. And the managers absolutely did not intend to make it a place where people couldn't challenge what was going on. But that was what was happening. And so by having numbers about these things, rather than someone grumbling over a cup of tea, suddenly people start to look for a solution, because it wasn't their intention for that, but that's what was happening. And so you can start to, you know, by putting, I mean, you are putting very rough numbers on difficult things to measure, but But I mean, I sometimes say that there's this Chinese expression, myth that, story that the finger that points to the moon is not the moon. And that's what indicators are. They're pointing towards a moon, but they still are only a finger. So and I think often statisticians get far too worried about the second decimal place of some relationship. And really, what we want to know often is a direction of travel, is are we getting better or are we not? And so I'm quite happy with indicators which are roughly right, rather than the ones which are sometimes precisely wrong. So, how do we do that? And that's what this tool is trying to do. And it's obviously easier to do this in an organisation. We know what the boundaries of an organisation are. But there's no reason why one couldn't do this in communities, in other contexts, or with individuals, and create distance-travelled indicators that are sort of like this. And that's where we want to take it. And I want to make our indicators tactile, useful, interesting for people, because I'm very interested in data, and I want to share that enthusiasm with people. And the idea really is to take people to a level beyond where they expected they wanted to go. Normally people look at numbers, they don't want to do anything with them, but suddenly you make them icons and clickable, they start being interested in it and moving around it, and it's much more of a sort of tactile experience. So that's what we try and do with this tool. So that's in an organisation. It's sort of quite easy to think about in an organisation, but we can also think about the fact that happiness not only generates profitability, not only generates resilience for an organisation by keeping its staff, but in a sort of public health context, we know that happiness, well-being generates health. So actually, well-being can be a way of delivering health in some ways, it's increasing people's well-being. We know that people who've got high levels of positive mental health, happiness, well-being, have less acute illnesses, have less chronic illnesses. They absorb health information better, that people who are open hear things more, they hear what the doctor says to them, they read the pamphlets more, they go away and do those actions more than people who are closed, negative, down. They're going to do them less. So they're going to get better health outcomes for that as a reason. They also live longer, really quite considerably longer than unhappy people. There's a very famous nun study. I don't know if you've heard of the nun study, but have you heard of it? But I really like it because there's such a nice group of people in that they live similar lives, similar food, similar work. And what's happening with these nuns is splitting them. So you know about their diaries that they wrote when they were teenagers. When they entered the convent, they all wrote diaries about their autobiography, and researchers have now gone back and categorised them as happy and unhappy nuns, effectively. And then they've lived their whole lives, so it's the 1920s in the States, and they're now starting to die. And what you get is by the time they're 90, you can see that the happy nuns, which is the top group, are living about 11 years longer than the unhappy nuns. It's a really very big effect on life expectancy. Now, there's all sorts of things. Already by the time you're 18, there's things that have happened that may have been. But if government is really interested in longevity, then it should be messaging a lot on happiness and well-being. Obviously, messages on weight, on exercise, on diet. Now, is it doing those to reduce costs in the NHS? Or is it doing that to promote better lives for people? Probably if you ask a senior politician, it's to promote better lives for people. Probably the reality is maybe some of the other. But in a sense, I think it says what a powerful question it is to say, what is the point of this policy? Is it delivering well-being? What would policy look like if it's doing well? Because if we're really interested in policy delivering life expectancy, then we should be very much investing in the happiness of our population. It's a bigger effect than body mass index, which I reassure myself sometimes. But it is a big effect.
So Nick, can I just ask you, because I can hear sort of Ian Duncan Smith might be saying that, about, because he's into happiness, isn't he? And I mean, I've heard him talk about, if youth started being happier and all the rest of it. And I love hearing what you're saying, and I'm up there, but I can't. Context still keeps coming back to me. And whilst we can't, what do you do about the environment and so on? Particularly in Sheffield, we've got the biggest health divide still.
Yeah.
And there will be people who can work with this, but it feels to me it's still based on an individual model.
Yes.
And that sense of agency.
It still requires a sense of agency to engage with the 5 ways. I've got some data on that in a minute, actually, about the. Well, in fact, I'm just coming to it. Okay. So I'm not disagreeing with you that I think it is something that we need to work on with the narrative around it. That we're not trying to say there aren't structural inequalities and how we deal with that. So yeah. Okay. So this is what I was going to come to really now, which is that this is the cross-sectional relationship between household income and well-being in the UK, and that's a fitted log curve, and basically we have what could classically be called a falling marginal utility of income, which is that the more you earn, the less important it becomes to your well-being. And our eyes are very drawn to the bottom left and the top right, and actually the data point on the very far left is very, very few people, and the data points on the far right are very few people. So if we look at actually what the quintile groups are, then the bottom 20% of income earners in the UK are to the left of that line, and the top 20% are to the right of that line. So we have most people, 60% of the population, living in the middle, and we have 20% who obviously their well-being looks suppressed at the bottom of the income pile, and we have 20% on super incomes out to the right. So if you look at that by quintile group,
it's quite interesting. It doesn't dip at the end.
There's some new evidence. No, there is some new evidence out of the USA, which is looking at precisely this. Gallup have been polling every week in the USA for the last year, so they've got hundreds of thousands of people in the data set now. And they now can differentiate. This is actually a measure called life satisfaction, which is asking you how satisfied are you with your life, which is what's called a cognitive question. It's like an overall evaluation. And then they ask people about their moods day to day. What they find in the USA is that the sort of satisfaction, cognitive reflection, keeps on going up, right up to super incomes. But mood does exactly what you say, it dips down. But it still peaks at quite a high, I think it's $75,000 in the USA is the peak of mood, and then it falls, which is still quite a high income, yeah. But it does fall. They get more stressed.
What's the 50,000 study that came out last week?
That's the 75,000 US one transfer. So I was on I can't remember what Radio 4 program it was called. What's the lunchtime one called on Radio 4?
You and Yours.
Yeah, I was on You and Yours about it, and I kept on saying that. Well, I didn't. I said once because there's not so much time, but one, it's a US figure, and the UK, there's no reason to assume that we'd be exactly the same as Americans. So to start saying that you can convert $75,000 to £50,000 is sort of rather ludicrous, because their income inequalities look different than ours, they're sharper than ours. There's all sorts of things. So we can't say that suddenly 50,000 in the UK, that would be repeated as a result. So, but I would think anecdotally we would expect emotional well-being, the more ones about our day-to-day life, to at least flatten off totally, if not fall slightly, which is what does happen in the USA. So when you put it into 20% quintiles, these aren't exactly, they're between 18 and 22%, because it's using bands, so you can't exactly get them, but it's roughly quintiles. What you can do is you can think about, you still see this curve going here, slightly flattened out because you pull people down, but you can see particularly that the lowest 20% of household income in the UK really does have lower well-being. But what's interesting is that you can think about going back to the 5 ways about how people do the 5 ways in their life, and these again are not quite perfect questions for the 5 ways, but the best we've got from a survey that gets to them approximately. We'd like to do this better. But what you find is people who've got sort of poor actualization of the 5 ways, they all have lower well-being, and the people who are poor and have poor actualization have a much lower well-being. When you go to medium, you sort of return to the curve before. But when you go to high activization of the 5 ways, they basically flattened off, okay? And I think this is very interesting in that, you know, it's gone pretty flat by there. And the issue is, and the question that always annoys me so much in the wellbeing research is, you know, does money buy you happiness? Because I think it's the wrong question. Because does money buy you happiness is saying, it's not talking to our structural inequalities, it's not talking to social injustices, it's talking to middle class people saying you should work harder, sort of thing, is what the rhetoric of it is. And actually, you know, if you earned more, you would be happier. You know, that's where its main thing is going. And it's really asking us to go up some line like this, that somehow if we move our household income up, we're going to get happier. Well, one, the line doesn't exist very much once we've got beyond a certain point. And secondly, it's so non-trivial to move from a household income of 20,000, 25,000 to 50,000. It is like, that is years and years of overtime, neglecting your partner, your children, your friends, you know, to do that for this very, very small hypothetical increase in happiness. So if people were really wanting to get happier, trying to earn a lot more money is about the most inefficient way you could do that. And you'd be much more effective and efficient to think about moving from medium levels of 5 ways or poor levels of 5 ways upwards. That'd actually be a much more effective way for you to do that. So you'll notice that I haven't let the line go down to the bottom 20% here. I'm talking about upwards from there, and that's quite deliberate because what we also have happening is that there's a huge social gradient on how people activate the 5 ways, which is really your agency question, which is that you can see that nearly 50% of people on low income are poorly activating the 5 ways. And I think this is your sense of agency issue. And now, what I probably think is that if we think about, I think, you know, what Gordon Brown used to talk about taking children out of poverty, I think he meant that in a very noble way. I think he's an honest man. But is helping a household income from whatever it is, I don't know the figures exactly, but if you were, you know, a single mother with a child on benefits, maybe it's 12, yeah. Helping them to 16, is that an effective way to bring a child up to be a healthy, adjusted adult? Maybe actually supporting the mother and the child to do more activities and increase their sense of agency would be much more effective. And that our intervention should be less about reducing financial poverty and more about reducing emotional 5 ways poverty and doing those more directly. So we're basically saying we should increase income as a proxy, I believe, to doing activities which generate well-being. Now, it's interesting, there's all sorts of causal loops that I think would flow out of this. Is actually, if you could help them with their sense of agency, they probably then would actually then go and lead lives which they probably earned a bit more money at least, you know. And so I think the intervention could be considered much more well-being. So what these might look like is coaches in poor communities rather than community centres that actually should be investing in helping people find, you know, what your passion is and what you can do with that, what you're interested in, what your skill is, wherever you're from, and actually how to create an enterprise, a social business, or just a community of interested spirits. You know, it might be, I don't know, anything, you know. And I think that actually if government dared to invest in those processes, they probably would find they would generate economic benefits later anyway. But even so, they would generate the well-being benefits now.
It's a lovely example in the teenage pregnancy strategy, really, because they started off talking about the need for aspiration as something that wasn't seen in young women having babies very young, but it got lost somehow. Insofar as we did some work with young parents, and there's some lovely data around how we did ask them what they would do if they did have more money, and we couldn't get any of them, even through doing these workshops, to think about doing anything for themselves. So if you had money to go on a course, it had to be something that would benefit your child in order to be seen as a good parent against the backdrop of being seen as deviant. And so it's really ringing some bells for me in terms of it's just a luxury. They couldn't afford to do anything that wasn't expedient to getting a better job, more money, getting on
Yeah.
on that track. So
Yeah.
to do it the other way around would be a marvellous way of trying to realise that aspiration. I mean, aspiration in its widest sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about money.
Yeah. I think so, and there are teenage pregnancy programs that do that, probably outside of government. I hear the one about teens and toddlers. I don't know if you've heard that one.
There's some amazing projects,
Yeah.
but even if it's within, it's still on an individual level.
Yeah.
It's particularly for young women who want to do the best job they can in difficult circumstances. There's this notion of not being able to do anything for yourselves. The notion of making time to volunteer, for instance, in the context you're speaking, would be seen as a luxury they just couldn't afford.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have an economic imperative.
Yeah. Yeah.
To what extent do different levels of actualisation of the 5 ways or levels of well-being mitigate the impact of low income on longevity, or do we not have any?
I just don't think there is. I hadn't seen a study that does that. That doesn't mean to say they don't exist, but I mean, this data.
I mean,
this data isn't published. We haven't published this yet because I'm actually not. They're not the best questions on 5 ways. They're using a survey and stretching it. We're actually hoping to get involved in the European Social Survey next year. We're going to ask 5 ways questions. We have to do this properly. But I think that I don't know. Maybe I mean there are definitely. I've seen general population means of well-being and longevity, and general population means of well-being and acute instances of heart attacks all reducing. And I've seen people hold. I know people hold for income, and I know they hold for even loneliness, even whether you live it on your own. So I imagine that they, if you just looked at those segments of the population, they would exist, that data. But I can't tell you hand on heart that I know what it is.
I'm involved with a sort of wellbeing project in the East End of Sheffield, and we have health trainers and health champions.
Yeah.
Are you saying that those sorts of people work individually with whoever in the community could promote the 5 ways and help? I mean, are you saying that you're sort of saying that would be more useful than trying to tackle the income?
I really don't want to say that we shouldn't deal with structural inequalities but in the context where we are, I think this is a fresh way of thinking about how we can do something in a different way. And I think it is a little bit more empowering for a lot of people because we know our structural inequalities are pretty here to stay. They're very difficult to deal with and most of us can't do anything about them. So I do think we can use these sort of ways to do things in that circumstance. Clearly, I'd rather we had a Danish or Norwegian income distribution and we didn't have the structural inequalities that we had. We're the second most unequal income in Western Europe. Only Portugal's worse than us. So it's, we're not very good at that. But I think the 5 ways offer us a way to work with people's energy a bit more rather than just with their circumstances. So I think it's slightly humanising to work. But I would have thought we should do them in parallel with things. So if you're delivering health benefits, it's like, using the 5 ways in those. So, maybe just, in the way that you deliver health programs in the community is think about how do they connect people? How do they, get people to be active, probably be part of it anyway, but, to keep learning, to take notice. I know someone did this program, I really liked it. It was a terrible word he invented, but he called it photography. But basically, he was trying to get people to walk more. And one of the ideas is they put these pedometers on them and they measure it. But the way he got it to do was he got them interested in photography, and then they would walk for quite a while to take a picture of a particular tree or something like that. And then they would come back and they'd develop the photographs together or whatever. And so he had masses of, he had a group of them doing it. He had Be Active in there. He had Take Notice because it was doing that, because it was, observational beauty, and it was a volunteering project. So he deliberately used the 5 ways to frame what he was doing. And it, really fun. Yeah.
I'm an occupational therapist.
Yeah.
and we've been doing this since the beginning of our profession.
Yeah.
And it's like heaven listening to you speak, because it feels like our sort of philosophy is kind of very, very current.
Yeah.
And I've certainly used the 5 in my teaching for OT students. But I think we've been very bad at describing what we do in scientific terms, which obviously this is going to help us, I think. But what you're talking about is I recognise as an occupational therapy approach to health and well-being.
I think that's one of the things that we're doing with the Wellbeing Agenda, is we're actually giving people confidence to carry on what they're doing. And the good practice is out there in so many different ways. But it's been hard to prove what you're doing is good practice, because you've been asked to do bums on seats or economic generation. Arts project, we did an arts project about measuring the wellbeing impact of theatre, and all they get to do is bums on seats and ethnic diversity of bums on seats, and so they find it very, very frustrating. But when we gave them a measure that showed how much they were challenging people's meaning, challenging people's values, and how much they were entertaining and creating a multi-dimensional model of it, they loved it. Now, actually, whether they can get funding on the basis of that, I don't know. But at least it made them feel heard that actually what they were doing was having a positive impact on people. So...
You're making me very happy.
Thank you. That's my job, actually. That's probably my key outcome indicator, is to actually... and to try and give people a structure that they can multiply what they're doing, what's good, because I think there is so much good practice out there. It just gets crowded out by the economic forces so often. I can't remember what's coming next, so I'll just push and see. Okay. So in a way, I've got to the end of that second section, which is about happier society, and the sort of idea, I haven't really fleshed out yet. What you're seeing here, by the way, is basically my book chapter titles for a book I'm trying to write. And I haven't quite fleshed out about exactly what a happier, more caring, altruistic society would be, but I want to push against the big society framework and just try and make it a bit better. So I'll just go through these next ones quite quickly. So we talked about income inequality in the UK. This is income inequality globally across the whole planet. And the poorest 50% of the world are living on about less than $2.50 a day. And that blue line, which says income equality line, would be if everybody earned the same amount, that's what global income would be. And you'll see the top of the graph is cut off because you have to start doing this before you get to the top 1% of earners in the whole world. And just so you know that if your household income is over £28,000, you're in the top 1% of earners in the world. And that's what the global inequalities,
1%.
top 1%.
So right up at the top you talk.
Yeah, that last, it might be the top 5%, sorry, I have to remember now. I think it's the top 1% if your household income's over 30,000 a year of the whole globe, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's
your
kind
household income, not your individual, your household.
Household. It's there is a website you can go to. I can't remember its website address, but you put in what your income is, and it'll tell you where you are on the global scale. And we actually are globally richer than we think we are. Now, that doesn't mean to say that's not our comparison group. Our comparison group tends to be other people in the same country, but it is interesting to see what it looks like. And we don't only have global inequalities. We also have I gone up instead of down? We have this sort of thing going on. That's the polar ice cap, 1979, and that's a picture, and that's it in 2003. So we have shrinking ice caps and changing climate, and again, it's the poorest of the world that tend to experience that. That's where the topsoil's going. That's where they're unable to protect themselves against the changing climate. So, does happiness make any sense in this world of huge inequalities and climate change? And are we just being very frivolous? Obviously, I'm going to say no, but I do understand the question. I think it's a valid question when people ask this. And this is really why I think it is, which is that we've tended to think of the economy, NEF's vision is that economy is if people and planet matter, okay? But actually the orthodox economy has always thought of that, but it's thought of people and planet as serving the economy. Effectively, that's labour and materials in economic terms, is that they're seen as inputs to the economy. And not only have, and they're there to deliver, apparently we're there to deliver growth and the planet is here to deliver economic growth, would be the sort of rhetoric of orthodox economics, if you put it in bare terms. And what's happened over the years is that we've tended to tax labour more than we have materials. And what's happened to that is that we've got into a sort of global fight for finding the cheapest labour we need to, and but we're not really very worried about how many materials we use to get there. So every time we have productivity gains, it tends to be a loss, less labour, more technology, and often more energy and more materials flowing through the economy. And so we basically haven't valued labour. We basically said we'll use as many resources and reduce labour as possible. So an example would be, the car industry. Actually, it's probably a more rewarding job to repair a car and to keep it going than it is to build a car in a factory. But we've created a whole taxation system which encourages people to buy new cars and not to keep repairing their car. So if we had an economy where we wanted to build cars to last, we'd have the jobs created in the small family businesses that do MOTs and car repair, and we'd lose them in the factories. But maybe that would be a really good thing because they'd have nicer jobs. Because we're valuing we're not valuing the materials so much, and we're so not valuing the materials that that WWF and other people estimate that we need 3 planets if everyone was to have a lifestyle of UK population. So we don't have 3 planets, so that's a bit inconvenient. So we need to shift the tax burden, and rebalance it, and actually think about how do we tax carbon, how do we tax material flows. Maybe we we actually reduce the tax burden on labour, and start shifting it towards resources much more, in one way to create a new economy. But really, that's still thinking about how these things serve the economy, and we really need to shift it around and think about well-being as the ultimate aim of the economy. That really the economy should be in the service of people. And I talk about 2 ideas there really, which is one is green growth, which has talked a lot about how do we get green growth, how do we get sustainable growth, how do we do that? And that's really saying how do we create units of GDP for less carbon or less greenhouse gases or less environmental damage. And that's fine to a point, but we also need to check that actually the growth is needed at all. Is it actually delivering any human well-being? Are these things doing anything? And I sometimes talk about the difference between a which report. A which report is like, which do you choose? Well, that's green growth. Which technology do you choose? But we also need a new type of report, which is a weather report, which is whether we need the damn thing in the first place, and whether we actually should be spending our resources on that at all. Is it generating human well-being? And then we can also think about how the relationship, in the sense the economy becomes a means to an end rather than an end itself. And so if we're going to think in a radical way, which is obviously what we try and do at a think tank, is you can think about a relationship directly. The economy's in that arrow somewhere, but actually, how good are we at converting our environmental resources into well-being? And this is the work that we did I don't know if any of you heard of it, the Happy Planet Index, which is basically saying that, the idea of nations should be to create well-being for people, and we should think about how efficiently we do that. And we measure well-being at a population level by life expectancy, how long people live, and we adjust that for happiness. So instead of disability-adjusted life years, this is really happiness-adjusted life years. It's quality and quantity of life. And we divide that by our ecological footprint, how much pressure we put on the planet. And so we're trying to make an efficiency measure, effectively. And the way to show you that, it's approximately, because there's some jiggery-pokery we do, because we're statisticians, but the easiest way to show you is this graph, where running across the bottom is ecological footprint, where more is bad, that's more pressure on the planet, and running upwards, where more is good, is how good nations are at generating happy life years for their citizens. And the yellow dot there is the global mean. That's the global average. But there's a massive array of nations around that. So up to the top right are countries such as the USA, lot of generating reasonable levels of well-being, not the highest, but reasonable, but using a lot of planet to get there. Bottom left, Western Europe goes across the top. You know, we're in the middle at the top there, the UK. Gulf states are in there as well. They use a lot of energy. And their citizens have got relatively high levels of well-being, but it doesn't measure the guest workers there, which is a different issue and one we shouldn't forget. But bottom left is sub-Saharan Africa, you know, which is not putting much pressure on the planet, but it's not generating much well-being either. You know, short, brutish lives in Hobbesian terms. 41 years is life expectancy in Zimbabwe. Malaria, HIV/AIDS, conflict, big problems in those areas. And running through the middle are some Asian countries coming up towards the yellow dot, and then the diamonds are Latin American countries, and which are relatively high levels of well-being and reasonable levels of footprint, though there is some that are going over. And the country sat up by its own. If those of you who know the Happy Planet Index, it's Costa Rica, where they live.
Standing army.
No standing army. That's precisely right. And very egalitarian society for Latin America, and the army in Latin America tends to be used against the poor. It's actually an oppression device, really, rather than a defensive device. And they live longer than people in the USA. 78.5 is their life expectancy. In the USA is 77.8, I think. But anyway, younger. It's slightly less than us in the UK, but same as us. And they also are, according to the latest Gallup, to mention my favourite friends, World Poll, they're the happiest nation on the planet, happier than Denmark. Now, it's the only data point we've got from Costa Rica, and it's very, very high, but I think that even if it is slightly out, it's roughly right from everything I've heard from Costa Rica. And Latin America as a whole, people are much happier than you'd expect for the level of GDP. They're much happier than transition Eastern European countries, which have similar levels of GDP. And that's because they're much more socially connected. They're much more vibrant. They're much more alive communities with much more local identity.
Where is Cuba?
Cuba is very interesting because...
It's like the shell icon, actually, your little yellow blob. Freaking me out a bit.
Perhaps I'll change the colour. Cuba, which, as probably you know, does really well on the Human Development Index, life expectancy, literacy, less good on GDP, but out of 3 it does well. Happiness, it doesn't do so well. It's the scale of 0 to 10. Costa Rica is 8.4 something. Cuba is 6.7, 6.6, something like that. And I think that is interesting because I think what I hear from Cuba is that I've never been there. Have you been to Cuba?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yep.
Is that there isn't people. There's some dissatisfaction in the population.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
So although from a Human Development Report perspective it looks good, I think the happiness data actually reveals that phenomena. And that's not to say they don't have good life expectancy. It's not to say they don't have good literacy rates, but they're not generating much well-being, happiness.
But you're saying that Costa Rica, because of presumably the 5, they're doing well with their 5. Their social cohesion is good. Do you think that Cuba isn't so socially cohesive?
I don't know I don't know very much about Cuba. I think that it's that they are not having they're not challenges, learnings, I don't.
Hugely regulated.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Changing a lot recently with opening up to the world.
Yeah.
Maybe reduce their satisfaction.
Yeah. And the US embargo of them, I think, has been pretty cruel for a long period of time. But so I think it's quite interesting that Cuba does less well. Still does well, to be honest.
Where's Japan? I read that Japan
They got.
Japanese live longest.
They do.
at the
They live
moment.
81, 82 years, and I think
Wow.
Norway is the second longest, or Switzerland. But and that's a lot to do with diet. They, but they're less. They report less happiness, and you do get into cultural issues here, in that in Japan it's almost a bit too proud to say you're happy, and in America it's almost an admission of social failure to say you're not. So there are some cultural things going on with when we compare data, and there are statisticians who think you should not compare international data at all. I think we have to recognise that there's some error, and what's the size of the error. I think it makes perfect sense that Zimbabwe is the least happy country, and that Denmark, Norway, Costa Rica, Iceland are very high. There's reasons we can explain that. So I don't think it's useless, but I think that differences between Asia and Europe need to be explored more. And I think that, like we have purchasing power parity for GDP, we start thinking what a basket of goods cost in one country or another. I think we do need to start considering what a basket of well-being goods in one country look like on a well-being indicator in another, and making some adjustment. But that would take quite a lot of investment in our statistical apparatus, which there's been none. So, but you can see how we could think about doing that. Yeah. And what really the aim should be is to move the global mean up there. And then we've created a happier planet. And so the interventions are very different in different parts of the world. Some of them, they're about reducing inequalities and reducing global poverty and, helping them achieve some level of development. And others of us, it's about reducing our ecological footprint while maintaining or increasing levels of well-being. And they're very different challenges and need a different set of interventions to do them. And I'm very near the end of it. This is the time trends for the richest nations in the world. So these are the ones that are more likely to be top right. From 1960 through to 2005, 45 years, half a human lifetime really. And we've seen the blue line is about how well-being has increased over that time. We don't have very good happiness data from pre-73, so the happiness data is estimated, that's why it's a light blue. But ecological footprint at that time has gone up, quite sharply at the beginning up to the first oil shock, and then some bumbling up, mainly following recessions, actually, the dips, is we consume less when we're in recession. But, and so in Happy Planet terms, we've actually got less efficient at how we generate well-being in that time. Turning our resources less well into well-being. And the point is, if we scrunch this and go half a human lifetime into the future, then 2050 always seems the magical number about where we're trying to get to. A child entering school today will be my age in 2050. So it's not so far in the future, it's half a human lifetime. And this is what the EU and the UK target is on greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not business as usual in the next 45 years. To reverse that big trend. And that looks very frightening, but the Happy Planet message would be we need to keep on increasing well-being. I don't think anyone can go to the polls and say you've got to give up quality of life. And I think this is the problem that the environmental movement's got itself into, is that basically it's framed all its messaging in what we've got to give up, and using fear quite often to scare us into thinking about what we have to give up. But I think we need to think about hope and aspiration and prosperity in a different way in terms of well-being, and then start thinking about how can we simultaneously increase well-being and reduce carbon and other greenhouse gases. Obviously we have to do that even steeper there. And I really start thinking about what systems theorists call feedback loops, which is actually this is how I think of our work about indicators and public health messages, is how do we create momentum about turning these curves, because it's very easy to draw them, but actually how do you turn them? And systems theory will tell us that if we want to create a dampening feedback loop, negative feedback loop like at the top, then we need to get the right information to the right point of time. So for example, we know that smart meters in people's homes, where they show how much money they're spending on their energy right now, people start turning down the thermometer and turning off the lights much more because they can see how much they're spending now. Whereas if they only pay their bills every 3 months by direct debits, you don't notice, you have no emotional experience of paying for it. So we actually need to make our experiences of paying for things more emotional, more annoying in some ways around that. That's why I think the congestion charge works in London. It's annoying to pay. It's only £8. You pay that for parking anyway. People don't do it because it's annoying. They don't like paying it. I think we should explore annoying taxes much more. So we need to create damping. So what would that look like? I mean, I never know why I hear the FTSE 100 index on Radio 2 drive time at night. If I really want to know the FTSE 100 index, surely I'd go to a website and find it. Why do I have to be told it? Somehow it's saying that this is important. Well, why didn't we say how much energy Britain used yesterday? Did we meet our 3% target on reducing carbon emissions? You know, it was a warm day, so we used less energy, or it was a cold day, we used more. But you could adjust it quite easily and create a very meaningful indicator. And you could do that in real time. I mean, very much near to real time. All the power stations know what they're generating. It's just about investing in some data, you know, highways to bring that all together and make a sensible data thing. So I think that's what we should be doing there. Obviously, lots more things, but you know, but then we need the positive, enhancing ones for well-being, and those, the 5 ways to well-being, 5 fruit and vegetables, are examples of nudges, system nudges to actually do that, and that's what I think we should be investing our time in, and that's how I see our program of work developing into that way of thinking about feedback loops. So that's it. Thank you. Some websites.
Thank you very much. That's very, very challenging and interesting. Can I ask you about the measures of well-being?
Yeah.
And I'll explain. One of the reasons for my interest in this is that we're very concerned about inequalities in health in the city. It's been mentioned already.
Yeah.
And I should explain, I'm Director of Public Health for Sheffield, so
right.
I have to be involved and interested in it. And when we think about inequalities in health in Sheffield, by far and away the best data is about mortality. You know, because everybody who dies gets a death certificate. So if you want to look about differences in health experience across the city, you look at mortality data, because it's by far and away the most robust data.
Yeah.
But that, of course, immediately channels you in trying to address health inequality into looking at things that impact on the major mortality, causes of mortality, so coronary heart disease and cancer and so on and so forth, which is not a bad thing to do, because it's clearly wrong that people die 10, 12 years earlier in some parts of the city than others. But it does lead one to overlook, ignore measures of happiness and well-being. And we've not tended to look at that very much because we don't have good data on it.
Yeah.
And I don't know of any way of systematically collecting data on the well-being of the population that is sufficiently fine-grained that it can look at within population differences. So I can tell the difference between Darnall and Dore and Totley and Tinsley over time, but isn't going to cost us a small fortune to collect it.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what tools you use and whether there's anything that you're aware of that we could adopt and use within a city like Sheffield to monitor differences in well-being across the city and hence look at the impact of any policies we might put in place, like the stuff that Jack's leading on or helping with in Darnall. See if it actually improves well-being in Darnall to the extent where you can say, well, that made a real difference, so let's do that everywhere else.
Yeah. I mean, the well-being measurement all relies on use of surveys, instruments, which are obviously not cheap. I mean, are the place-based surveys that local councils do, are they divisible in those ways that you want?
No, they're not nearly fine-grained.
Not nearly fine-grained, because I mean...
And anyway, they've been scrapped.
Yeah, everything seems to be scrapped at the moment. I have no easy answer for you, because, you know, the wellbeing stuff is inherently subjective, and therefore you have to ask people, and therefore you have to... I mean, the only thing you can say is that online survey tools are much cheaper these days, but you need to then be...
Online.
You need to be online, but, you know, there are ways that people do now create, like representative samples from them, you know, synthetic representative samples from them. or you know, you do it. I mean, the best way to look at data is to create a panel, you know, that you follow through time, and so then you can work with smaller groups because you've got the longitudinal data, you know, which is more powerful than just a series of cross-sectional ones.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you could afford to set up some sample panel surveys and start the process, however small, in a couple of areas, and try and, you know, follow 200 people in an area rather than going for big cross-section, because that's very powerful data, and it would give you the narrative at least for what's going on. But whether you're going to catch people how you catch people not having heart attacks and not having things, I think is difficult.
Yeah.
What tools did the people who worked on gardening, you know, when they were talking about earlier, the allotments? Well, there's a big study, wasn't there, around the well-being relationship to being involved in collective allotment projects?
I don't actually know if it is a thing, but the main instrument that people tending to use is called WEMWEMS, the Warwick Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale, which is a freely available 8 or 12 item questionnaire, and it's
called
Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, WEMWEMS. It's definitely the nicest one out there. North East have done a big 30,000 sample of it, which is available to analyse, but obviously wouldn't include Sheffield. But it would give ideas around how those populations are doing. But
there's the biobank data as well. The biobank study, isn't there? Which is massive. It's all over the UK.
Yeah, that's true.
has it got any wellbeing questions in it?
Yes, it does have a lot of wellbeing questions.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not longitudinal, is it?
I think the idea is that it
will
is.
be.
That it will be. Well, I thought
You
it
mean
was
that
well.
they'll repeat it, you mean? That they'll
Yes. I mean, I thought the idea is they collect all this massive baseline
Yeah.
data and then they're going to follow us up and see
Yeah.
when we die, basically, and how much hospital use there is. They're not that kind of baseline survey that included all the wellbeing questions.
Okay.
I
so they're not gonna
don't.
repeat
I'm not
any of
aware that there is any plans to repeat
Okay.
that kind of cross-sectional.
But they could.
They could do. Yeah.
could do.
So that all that data's is there.
I think there is a lot of data out there that hasn't been analysed. You know, I mean, we obviously can only do work that we've got budgets for, but there are data sets out there. Definitely got data, but they're not going to give you the fine-grained, you know, ward by ward data that I think you want. I think the only way you'll do that is by investing in it, and then you have to
Yeah.
make a big case for it.
Yeah.
But you know, our thing would be, most measurement is post hoc, after things have happened, you know, and actually, I think the idea of 5 ways and things is how can you design it into processes regardless of whether you've got measurement and, you know, and you know, but yeah, I don't, you know, sure. The only idea really is to do it cheaper, is to do some panel surveys that give you the amount of.
The real challenge there would be to get your panels to be representative there, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and keeping them is very hard.
Yeah.
Though mobile phones work better, I think, now than people used to change addresses. That was hard. So I think tracking people with mobiles and taking the mobiles of their parents and friends and things. So you've got triangulation of how to find them again. But yeah, I'm not an expert on how you construct surveys, but I think they are getting easier. People are getting easier to track now with mobiles.
So have you got anybody's ear in our new government?
You know, disappointingly, we haven't.
I'm disappointed.
And there are people that are talking to them about wellbeing. But I think that one of the problems NEF has is that we are seen as left of centre think tank. And so we haven't. I have presented to the Tories when they were in opposition a couple of times, but we don't know, is basically the answer. I know that Professor Felicia Butts from Cambridge, she's been to see Cameron and talked to people about flourishing, and there's this guy, Marty Sullivan from the States, who's been over. And I don't dislike their work, but I don't think it goes as far as ours. So we're thinking about how to draw attention more to our work without being too overly critical.
Can you subvert the big society then?
Well, that's a bit what I'm trying to do with that narrative, is to think about how do we make big better and happier. I do think it could be part of their rhetoric, but I think that they were very strong on wellbeing. Cameron was very strong on wellbeing before he was elected, and it'd be interesting to see. I think they're so obsessed with the spending review and slashing everything that I think they think at the moment.
I mean, it depends as well. From some of when we were talking about how you might evaluate this or collect evidence, it seems to me that we don't have a script anymore. Because if you talk in these terms in some audiences, it just seems so hippie-ish that it will be dismissed, and it's how you begin to talk like that, because when they talk about the Tories talked about wellbeing at one stage, wasn't one of their ministers made a quip about, well, you know, it's I'm talking about poor people, you know, it might be a solicitor living in Barnes, and they thought that was a poor person. And it's how these things roll off their tongue so easily, and it's so relative, and it's how do we get to a place of understanding what their notion of well-being is?
Well, I think that when we do policy focused work, we definitely don't talk happiness, we talk well-being. We've got a whole strand of work called National Accounts of Wellbeing, which you can, there's a website, nationalaccountsoфwellbeing.org, and you can go and measure your own well-being on that. And I was thinking we're more public orientated tonight, so I didn't talk about it. But that is quite a multi-dimensional way of thinking about well-being. One of the things I'm trying to do is get away from well-being just being a good, bad utility function that economists use, and that's, you know, so that's what the dynamic model of well-being is about. And the National Accounts of Wellbeing, it does relate to the dynamic model, but it predates it, so it's actually not quite as sophisticated as the dynamic model. But it's all across Europe. It's comparing 22 countries across Europe and looking at that space. So you can start seeing that Portugal has got very low well-being, personal well-being because of inequalities, but it's got quite strong social well-being, trust and belongingness and things. The UK, we've got low trust and belongingness, and start to see differences between countries below the level of who's, you know, one rank order. And I think that if we're going to make wellbeing data useful, we've got to give many entry points for policy to it. So creating it in a multidimensional way is a way of doing that. And government says, oh, we don't like subjective indicators, but to be frank, the fear of crime is a subjective indicator, but the consumer confidence indicator, which they use a lot, is a subjective indicator. So it's actually about how you use subjective data that they always say, oh, we don't know about it. People change their mind in polls, but it's not a poll. It's a, you know, it's a very different beast of an instrument, but politicians tend to be quite shallow about how they think about it. Yeah. So it is a whole area of work we're trying to develop, but it's, you know, I think it's quite an uphill struggle to get people to take it very seriously.
I think it's fabulous to see it all. Something that feels a bit more hard-hitting coming out on the public stage. It's great.
Yeah.
I suppose I'm still really frustrated because there's a consultation out at the moment from Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, and it's talking about skills for sustainable growth. And it's like, at what point will this government realise that what we don't need is economic growth? There's a phrase which says that what we need is personal, spiritual and community growth. And that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah.
But then there was a lovely comment from a survey that was carried out in Sharrow. And the survey was saying, well, what do you need in this area? What additional development do we need to do here? And the comment that came back was, we don't. We just need to. Can you explain to us how to be happy?
But it could be cheaper. Couldn't you get in on the cheaper thing? And like, if to do it well and to evaluate it, but all of these things.
Yeah, no, I think you can do. I mean, I think, you know, to be frank, if, you know, the way that government is doing cuts, it should really think about cutting the things that don't deliver well-being and keeping the things that do. But it's quite hard to make that cut and knife to do that. I don't know, we're not very good at being a bit pragmatic and dirty in some ways. Maybe we're too highfalutin sometimes about things, but you know, I think we were thinking about doing, you know, when the spending review came out, people are going to start saying, what's the effect on jobs, what's the effect? We were starting to think about doing a paper, what's the effect on well-being? But we've asked for what data's coming out and we can't actually estimate it from that. So I think we might do something in the new year about, you know, there's a bit more, you know, what's government policy been like this year for well-being, and start thinking about doing that twice a year or something like that, to make it a little bit more got a new guy in who comes from the policy field much more than I do. I mean, I'm basically someone with an idea and statistician, and he's actually had years of policy experience, and he's much more. I mean, there's a whole different language, isn't it? The policymakers speak, and he's embedded in that, and he's more direct in that way, which is very good for us, because we've tended to be a team of psychologists and statisticians thinking about it, and he's actually helping us ground it a bit more in what would this mean for budgets and da-da-da.
Just another comment, which is I'm quite interested that, I mean, it's great that you're thinking in aspirational terms and positive terms that people can get hold of. I'm interested that you haven't touched on, say, the model of consumerism that we have, kind of definite deficit model that people carry around in their heads that is filled up with consumerist stuff, and addressing any of that, and you're kind of bypassing that with just some practical things that people can do in the 5 ways.
Yeah, no, I think that I would definitely agree with you about that, and we've certainly written previously on materialism and the downside of that. So it might be that I haven't talked about it today, but it is something we do talk about, values and all that sort of stuff through time. So I would agree with you. Did I say about the gift thing, $100 to 2 groups of people?
Yeah.
I mean, that's an example of how retail therapy doesn't work, sort of thing. And I think, do you know Tim Jackson's work? He does a lot on that, and about the way that our identities and meaning have become related to consumer goods, and how it's a poor way of doing that. I have missed it tonight. Maybe I should include that more in my. Yeah, because I would agree. I think it's consumerism is an inefficient way to generate well-being. I'm going to be fundamentalist about it. I quite like the efficiency term because it just sort of cuts through it a bit rather than saying it's bad. Just inefficient, it's ineffective.
Nick, are these what's on your website?
Well, there's all these reports, and there's another one, as I said, a National Council one, but you can find all of them from New Economics or from my website. They all link together, the websites. But so there's stuff all available as reports on there, and I know that I gave the guys the presentation. I'm very happy people have the presentation.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah. And then I don't know if any of you know the TED Talks, but if you go to TED.com, there's a talk by me. So if you want to show me to anybody else, you can go there, and there's an 18-minute talk there, basically on this sort of stuff.
Has anybody got any last comments? Well, it just remains to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So much happier. It's given me faith. So thank